5 minutes before he was born, a king woke up screaming in a marble palace 400 miles from Mecca, and he did not know why, and neither did anyone standing in that palace with him that night. That king was Khosrow, the Kisra of Persia, ruler of the mightiest empire on earth. A man who believed his throne had been placed there by the fire god himself, a man whose armies had humbled Rome and whose treasury overflowed with the wealth of half the known world. And on that night, the night the world was about to change forever, the ground beneath his palace began to shake. 14 balconies carved from stone that had stood for centuries cracked and fell to the earth in the dark. Servants ran through marble corridors with torches shaking in their hands, certain their empire was ending, and in a way, they were right. Because at that exact hour, in a small house in Mecca, a woman named Aminah was giving birth to a boy who would not just survive that empire. He would outlast it. You already know his name. Muhammad, peace be upon him. But what you may not know is what else was happening in that same window of time, in cities and deserts and palaces the newborn child would never visit, as if the entire earth had been given advance notice that something had arrived. Not a king, not a conqueror, something rarer and stranger. Mecca itself, at the time this child was born, was not a capital, not a seat of empire, not a city that appeared on the maps drawn by Persian cartographers or Byzantine scholars. It was a modest trading settlement built around a well and a cube-shaped sanctuary, ruled loosely by tribal custom rather than kings, a place where camel caravans passed through twice a year, and little else marked it as significant to the wider world. Nobody in Ctesiphon, the Persian capital, had any reason to know the name of the tribe into which this child was born. Nobody in Constantinople had ever heard of the family of Hashim. And yet, according to the accounts we are about to walk through together, the two greatest empires on earth each experienced something unmistakable on the very night this unremarkable desert town welcomed a single newborn boy. If you stay with me for the next several minutes, I'm going to walk you through 12 of these events, one by one, exactly as they were recorded by the scholars who first collected and preserved them, and I want you to ask yourself a question as we go. What does it take to make a fire that burned without interruption for 1,000 years suddenly go dark in the very same hour that a child took his first breath in a house nobody in Persia had ever heard of, in a town too small to appear on any imperial map? Before we get to the 12 signs themselves, you need to understand what the world actually looked like in the year 570, because without that picture, the events that follow will feel like scattered folklore rather than what they actually were, a series of specific ruptures in a very specific, very real historical moment. The Arabian Peninsula at that time had no central government, no unifying law, no shared written language of governance. Tribes lived by custom and by the sword, and blood feuds could stretch on for generations, entire clans destroying each other over insults exchanged decades earlier by grandfathers long since dead. Baby girls were sometimes buried alive by fathers who considered daughters a source of shame, a practice the Quran would later condemn directly and repeatedly. Wine and gambling structured much of daily social life among the tribal elite. Slavery was ordinary and largely unquestioned. And religiously, the peninsula had become a patchwork of superstition, Christianity in pockets near the Byzantine frontier, Judaism established firmly in cities like Yathrib, which would later be renamed Medina, and everywhere else, a scattered idol worship that had drifted enormously far from whatever monotheism Ibrahim alayhi salam had once preached at the Kaaba itself centuries earlier. Beyond Arabia, the two dominant civilizations on earth, Persia and Byzantium, had spent generations locked in an exhausting cycle of war with each other, trading border cities back and forth, bleeding both empires of resources and manpower in conflicts that seemed to have no real end in sight. Both empires considered Arabia largely irrelevant, a dusty, ungoverned expanse of desert, good mainly for trade routes and little else. Certainly not a place from which anything of lasting historical consequence could possibly emerge. That assumption is precisely what makes what happened next so remarkable, because both of those dismissive empires were about to receive, on the very same night, a set of signs neither of them could explain, originating from a region they had never once considered worth watching closely. Let's start where it started. Not on the night of his birth, but 50 days before it. Because to understand the birth, you have to understand what almost stopped it from happening at all. In the year the Arabs would later call the Year of the Elephant, a man named Abraha ruled over Yemen on behalf of the Abyssinian crown. Abraha was ambitious, and he was proud, and he had built in the city of Sana'a a cathedral more magnificent than anything the desert tribes had ever seen, with gold ornamentation and marble floors, a building meant to draw the pilgrims of Arabia away from a small stone structure in Mecca and toward his own glory instead. But year after year, the caravans kept moving north, past his cathedral, toward the Kaaba, a house the Arabs believed had been built by the Prophet Ibrahim himself, alayhi salam, and his son Ismail, alayhi salam, a house that carried no gold and no marble, only faith. Abraha could not tolerate being ignored, so he decided he would remove the competition entirely. He assembled an army, and at the front of that army, he placed something the desert tribes had never laid eyes on: an elephant. Some accounts describe a small number of these creatures, others describe a great many, but the detail that survived most powerfully in the oral memory of the Arabs was a single enormous lead elephant, a war machine that towered over every man and horse in Abraha's force. An animal so foreign to the desert imagination that entire generations afterward would name that year by its presence alone, calling it simply al-Fil, the Year of the Elephant. Abraha marched north with the full intention of tearing the Kaaba down stone by stone, erasing it from the memory of Arabia. Word of his approach spread ahead of him, and the tribes along his path, unable to resist an army of that size, mostly scattered or surrendered. When his forces reached the outskirts of Mecca, the man responsible for the Kaaba at that time, Abdul Muttalib, the grandfather, the newborn prophet, would never fully know because he would die when the boy was only 8 years old, went out to meet Abraha, not to fight him, but simply to ask for the return of camels that Abraha's men had seized. Abraha was reportedly stunned. He expected pleading for the sanctuary itself, and instead this old man asked only for his livestock. Abdul Muttalib's answer has been preserved for 14 centuries. He said that he was the owner of the camels and that the house had an owner who would defend it himself. Then he walked away, and the people of Mecca retreated into the surrounding hills, leaving the Kaaba undefended by any human hand. The next morning, as Abraha's army advanced toward the sanctuary, something happened that no general in history could have predicted. The lead elephant, the animal meant to trample the walls of the Kaaba into rubble, knelt down in the sand and refused to rise. The soldiers beat it, drove spears into its flanks, tried every method they knew to force it forward, and the animal would turn and walk in any direction they pointed it, north, south, east, back the way it came. Only toward Mecca did it plant itself and refuse to move another step. And then, according to the account preserved directly in the Quran, the sky filled with birds. Not eagles, not vultures, but small birds arriving in dense, coordinated flocks, each one carrying stones no larger than a chickpea, clutched between their claws and beaks. The birds released these stones over Abraha's army, and where the stones struck, soldiers fell, their bodies breaking apart with a force no ordinary pebble could ever produce. Historians who recorded the aftermath described the army as reduced to something resembling husks of grain after a harvest, stripped and hollow, exactly as the Quran itself would later describe them. The massive force that had marched north to erase the Kaaba from the earth was itself erased instead, scattered and destroyed in a matter of hours, without a single arrow fired by the people it had come to conquer. Abraha did not die on that battlefield. He fled south, his body wasting away piece by piece with every mile of the retreat, his fingertips falling away first, according to the accounts, until by the time he reached Sana'a, he was so weakened that his chest split open and his heart gave out before he ever reached the safety of his own palace walls. The man who had set out with an army large enough to frighten every tribe between Yemen and Mecca returned home alone, dying, carried on a litter by the handful of soldiers who had survived, unable to explain to anyone what exactly had destroyed his force in a matter of hours, on an open plain with no enemy soldiers anywhere in sight. Word of what happened at Mecca that year spread across Arabia within weeks, carried by merchants and travelers along the same trade routes that had once carried news of Abraha's approach in the opposite direction. Caravans stopping in Mecca for trade heard the account directly from people who had watched it unfold from the surrounding hills, and carried that account onward to Yemen, to the Persian Gulf coast, and north toward Syria, so that within a single season, most of Arabia had heard some version of what had happened outside the sanctuary that year. Poets composed verses about it before the year was even finished. Entire tribes who had never once agreed on anything, tribes with generations of blood feuds between them, found themselves in rare agreement that something beyond ordinary warfare had taken place outside the walls of Mecca that day. And this is the detail worth sitting with. The people who witnessed this, or who heard it firsthand from those who witnessed it, were not distant chroniclers writing centuries later. Many of them were still alive when the same child, born 50 days afterward, grew into a man and began reciting the Quran aloud in the streets of that same city. Some of the very soldiers who had marched with Abraha and survived the retreat were, according to historical accounts, still living in Mecca decades later. Old men by then who could confirm to anyone who asked exactly what they had seen on that field. I want to pause here and be precise with you about the sourcing, because this matters. This is not a fragile story pieced together from weak chains of narration centuries later. This is a story Allah placed directly into the Quran itself, an entire chapter named after the event, Surah Al-Fil, the chapter of the elephant, recited by Muslims in prayer to this day. Have you not considered how your Lord dealt with the companions of the elephant? Did he not make their plan into misguidance? And he sent against them birds in flocks, striking them with stones of hard-baked clay. And he made them like eaten straw. That chapter was recited by the Prophet himself decades later to men in Mecca who had grown up hearing this exact story from their own fathers and grandfathers, men who did not question a single detail of it, because some of them had been children themselves when the birds appeared, and their fathers had stood in those very hills watching it happen. 50 days after that battlefield fell silent, Amina gave birth in Mecca to the boy who would grow up to recite that very chapter as revealed scripture. 50 days. Sit with the timing of that for a moment. The house he would be born into, the city he would walk through as a child chasing his cousins through narrow alleyways, the sanctuary he would one day personally cleanse of every idol surrounding it, had just been defended by heaven itself before he ever took a single breath. Some historians debate the exact number of days between the two events. Some sources say closer to 40, others say 60, but every early source agrees on the essential fact. The attack on the Kaaba and the birth of the one who would restore its purpose happened in the same short season, back to back, as if one event was clearing the ground for the other, as if the house was being protected specifically so that it would still be standing when its true guardian arrived. That is, event number 1. But it was only the beginning. Now travel with me across the desert, past the mountain ranges, into the heart of the Persian Empire, to the court of Khosrow, the Kisra, whose title alone meant something close to King of Kings, a ruler whose empire stretched from modern-day Iraq deep into Central Asia, whose armies had fought Rome to a standstill for generations. His palace, known as the Palace of Kisra, or sometimes called by its great arch, the Tak-e-Kisra, was considered one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, a structure so vast that its central arch remained the largest single-span brick vault on Earth for over 1,000 years after it was built. It contained a throne room designed to overwhelm any visitor with the sheer, crushing weight of Persian power. Gold thread woven into carpets, jeweled mosaics depicting the seasons, ceilings so high that a man's voice would echo back to him before he finished a single sentence. On the night the Prophet was born, that palace shook. According to the narration preserved by Imam al-Bayhaqi, transmitted through Hani al-Makhzumi, 14 balconies of that great palace collapsed in an instant, stone giving way to stone with no warning. No earthquake was recorded in the region strong enough to explain it. No siege, no war, no natural catastrophe that the court historians of Persia could point to and say, "Here, this is why our palace fell apart tonight." This detail alone would already be strange enough on its own, a royal palace shaking violently on an otherwise unremarkable night, with no war, no siege, and no recorded earthquake strong enough anywhere in the surrounding region to explain it. But it is what scholars noticed generations afterward, once they had the benefit of hindsight and the full sweep of later Persian history laid out plainly in front of them, that turns this from a strange, isolated anecdote into something considerably harder to simply dismiss as coincidence. Scholars who studied this narration in the centuries that followed noticed something that still unsettles people today when they hear it for the first time. 14 balconies fell, and after that single night, the Persian Empire would be ruled by exactly 14 more kings before the entire dynasty collapsed, conquered by the very companions of the child who had just taken his first breath in Mecca. The 14th and final king of Persia sat on that same throne during the caliphate of Uthman ibn Affan, radiyallahu anhu, one of the closest and most trusted companions the Prophet would one day have. What looked, on the surface, like a strange and unexplained structural collapse on one otherwise ordinary night, turned out generations later to have marked, balcony for balcony, the exact number of rulers left before an empire that had stood for centuries would be dismantled by the very faith being born in that small Meccan house that same evening. That is event number 2. Now stay in Persia, because that same night carries a third sign, one tied to the deepest religious identity of that empire. The Persians of that era were Zoroastrians, fire worshippers, and at the heart of their religion sat a flame that had never once, in living memory or recorded history, been allowed to go out. Priests tended it in careful, rotating shifts, day and night, generation after generation, feeding it, guarding it, treating any lapse as an unthinkable catastrophe for 1,000 uninterrupted years. It was not simply a fire to them, it was the center of their theology, physical proof to an entire empire that their gods were eternal and unshaken, a flame older than most of the buildings surrounding it. On the night the Prophet was born, that fire went out, not flickered, not dimmed. It went completely, totally dark, after 1,000 years of continuous burning without interruption. The priests responsible for it tried immediately to relight it, and according to the accounts passed down through the historical record, they could not manage it that night, an unprecedented failure that terrified the entire priestly order. The governor of that Persian province wrote directly to the Kisra to report what had happened, because nothing like it had ever occurred in the memory of anyone alive, or in the memory of their grandfathers, or in any written record the priesthood had ever kept across 10 centuries of careful tending. A fire that had outlived dynasties, outlived wars, outlived 1,000 years of Persian history and Persian kings and Persian conquest, extinguished itself in the exact hour that a child was born in a house in Mecca, a child who would one day be sent by God to call the entire world away from worshipping anything other than the one true Creator. If you wanted a single image to summarize the entire mission of Islam, you could not design a more precise one than this. The eternal false fire, worshipped for 1,000 years as though it could never be touched, gone dark the moment true guidance entered the world in the form of a newborn child, too small to lift his own head. That is event number 3. Now come with me to a fourth sign, still inside Persian territory, to a body of water the locals called the Lake of Sawa. This was not a small pond. It was a lake large enough that ships sailed across its surface, large enough to be considered sacred by the fire worshippers of the region, a source of civic pride and religious reverence for the empire that controlled its shores, its waters supplying towns and villages that had built their entire way of life around its permanence. On the same night, that lake began to dry. Some of the earliest accounts describe it sinking into the earth almost entirely within that single night, the water vanishing as though the ground itself had opened beneath it and swallowed the lake whole. Other accounts describe a more gradual retreat over the following period, its waters pulling back until what had once required a ship to cross could soon be walked across on dry, cracked earth. Either way, a lake that had existed as long as anyone in the region could remember, one revered by an empire that worshipped forces of nature as divine, began disappearing in the same short window of time that 14 balconies fell from a royal palace and a 1,000-year fire went dark for the very first time in its history. Historians who study this era, including some who approach it through a purely geological lens rather than a religious one, note that the wider region does carry a documented history of seismic activity capable of altering lake beds and underground water tables. And that detail matters because it tells you something important about the honesty of this story. These were not fictional embellishments invented centuries later purely to flatter the prophet's memory. They were real, observable, geographically plausible phenomena, the kind that show up in independent historical records kept by people who had no religious stake in Islam at all, converging in the same narrow slice of time as the birth taking place in Mecca. That is event number 4. Now we travel south again, back toward the deserts of Arabia, to look at what was happening not to distant empires, but to the small idols that dotted the peninsula in every direction. For generations, the Arabs of Mecca and the surrounding tribes had filled the area around the Kaaba and countless other locations across the peninsula with stone and wooden idols representing everything from tribal ancestors to celestial forces. 360 of them are said to have surrounded the Kaaba alone by the time the Prophet reached adulthood, each one representing some inherited superstition, propped up and worshipped by people who had drifted far from the message of pure monotheism that Ibrahim alayhi salam had originally preached at that very site, generations upon generations earlier. According to the narrations preserved in the Sirah literature, on the night of the Prophet's birth, these idols fell. Not one or two isolated statues, but reportedly every idol that stood, toppling forward onto their faces in the dust, as though something unseen had physically pushed each one down at the same instant. Picture that for a moment, really picture it. Statues that had stood upright for decades, carved and painted and treated with the reverence people usually reserve only for the divine, all collapsing in the same narrow hour that a child too small to even lift his own head was born into a house nearby, a child who could not yet speak a single word. It would take that same child 63 more years to grow, to receive revelation on a mountain outside the city, to be mocked and persecuted by his own tribe, to migrate under cover of night to a city that would welcome him, and finally to return to Mecca as a conqueror who forgave nearly everyone who had once tried to kill him, and to personally knock every one of those idols down himself with nothing more than a simple wooden staff. But on the night he was born, according to these accounts, they had already begun to fall, as if his entire life's mission had been announced in advance to the very objects that mission would one day come to destroy. That is event number 5, and it is worth remembering that these were not idols hidden away in temples or private shrines. They stood in the open, around the most visited site in Arabia, seen by every pilgrim, every trader, every child growing up in that city, a constant visual reminder of exactly what the community had drifted into worshipping instead of the God that Ibrahim alayhi salam had once called them back to at that same location. For them to fall on a single night, all at once, without wind or tremor recorded strong enough elsewhere in the city to explain it, was the kind of detail that people who lived through it did not simply forget by morning. Now let's look east, far beyond both Arabia and Persia, to the territory of the Byzantine Empire, the great Christian power of that age, ruled from the golden city of Constantinople, a city so fortified and so wealthy that it would remain standing for another 800 years after this night before finally falling to conquest. The Byzantines had spent generations locked in exhausting warfare with Persia, trading fortresses and border towns back and forth in a rivalry so old that neither side could fully remember how it had started, each convinced that God favored their cause over the others. According to some of the narrations later collected by historians, on this same night, the royal chapel connected to the Byzantine imperial court experienced a disturbance of its own, structures reportedly shifting, an unease recorded by court chroniclers who could not explain what had happened, even though they clearly felt that something significant had occurred. I want to be completely honest with you here, because this particular sign rests on considerably weaker chains of transmission than the ones involving Persia, and serious scholars of hadith across the centuries have flagged it as far less firmly established than the fire, the lake, or the palace of Kisra. I am including it here not because I want to inflate this list with 12 equally strong claims, but because it shows you something genuinely valuable about how this whole story should be approached. Reports of unusual disturbance on this particular night were apparently not confined to a single region, or a single religious tradition, or a single set of narrators with an obvious motive to exaggerate. Whether every detail of every single account carries equal historical weight. The broader pattern of two rival empires on opposite sides of the ancient world, sensing that something had shifted, appears across multiple independent lines of transmission. And that pattern itself is worth noting honestly, rather than either dismissing the whole thing outright or overselling it as ironclad the way so much content online tends to do. That is event number 6, and I wanted you to hear it with that honesty fully intact, because a story is only ever as strong as its willingness to tell you the truth about its own weaker threads, rather than smoothing every rough edge into false certainty. Now, back inside the house itself, to Amina, the mother whose body carried this child for 9 full months without a single one of the usual burdens of pregnancy that every other woman around her described in detail. She reported, and this account comes to us through Ibn Ishaq, one of the earliest biographers of the Prophet's life, whose work forms the foundation for nearly everything we know about this period, that she felt none of the fatigue, none of the physical strain, none of the heaviness that pregnant women in her community typically endured month after month. She said it was as if the pregnancy carried itself, light and undisturbed and almost weightless, all the way to the moment of birth. A detail that stood out enough to her that she mentioned it specifically to those around her, long before anyone understood what her son would eventually become. And before that birth, she had a dream, one detailed enough that it was carefully preserved and passed down through multiple independent narrators. In it, she saw a tremendous light leave her own body, a light so vast and so bright that it extended all the way to the palaces of Busra in Syria, hundreds of miles to the north, illuminating them from that impossible distance as clearly as if she stood beside them. In that same vision, she was told that the child she carried would be the master of his entire community, and that when he touched the ground at the moment of birth, she should seek refuge for him with God from the evil of every envious eye that might ever look upon him. She was told his name would be Muhammad, and that this exact name had already been written, centuries before that night, into the scriptures revealed to earlier prophets. Ahmad, meaning the most praised, is how he is named in some accounts describing the earlier gospel traditions. Muhammad, meaning the repeatedly praised, is the name written for him in the Quran itself, the finals and unaltered revelation that would come to him decades later. That is event number 7, the dream and the light that Amina herself described experiencing before her son had even been born into the world. It is worth remembering that Amina was not a woman with any particular reason to invent such a story. She was young, recently widowed, since her husband Abdullah had died on a trading journey to Syria before his son was ever born, and she would herself pass away only 6 years after giving birth, leaving her son an orphan twice over by the age of 6. She had no empire to build, no followers to gather, no reason to fabricate visions of light and inheritance for a child she would not live to see grow into manhood. What she reported plainly, to the small circle of people around her, long before any of them could have guessed what her son's life would eventually become. And then came the night of the birth itself, and with it, event number 8, the light that filled the house at the moment of delivery. Multiple companions of later generations narrated, through their own mothers and grandmothers who had either been present in that room or close enough to those who were, that on the night the messenger of Allah, peace be upon him, was born, an illumination filled the small space where Amina gave birth. So bright that everything inside the house became instantly visible, as though someone had opened the roof and let in the full light of midday. One particular narration describes a woman present in the room saying afterward that she could see the stars drawing closer, close enough that it felt as though they might fall directly upon her, an image so vivid that it stayed with her for the rest of her life. Whether that specific detail is meant literally, or whether it was simply the closest language available to describe overwhelming brightness to someone who had never in her life experienced anything remotely like it, the consistent thread across these independent accounts remains the same. Darkness gave way, suddenly and completely, to an unnatural, overwhelming light inside that small Meccan house, on a night in a city that had absolutely no reason to expect anything unusual at all. That is event number 8. Now we come to something recorded, not only in the oral traditions passed down through Islamic scholarship, but directly referenced within the Quran itself in connection to prophecy and revelation. In the centuries leading up to that night, the soothsayers and fortune-tellers scattered across Arabia had built entire careers, entire reputations, entire livelihoods around a very specific and closely guarded practice. They claimed to receive whispered fragments of information from jinn, unseen beings who would sneak up close to the boundary of the heavens and eavesdrop on conversations among the angels, catching stray pieces of divine knowledge before racing back down to earth to deliver those fragments to their human clients, mixing genuine information with deliberate lies in order to keep people confused, dependent, and endlessly paying for more predictions. This practice had gone on for generation after generation, an entire underground economy built almost entirely on stolen scraps of unseen knowledge that no human being was ever meant to possess. On the night the Prophet was born, that practice came to an abrupt and permanent end. The heavens, according to these preserved accounts, were suddenly guarded by an intense barrage of shooting stars unlike anything witnessed before in Arabian memory, driving away any jinn attempting their usual approach toward the boundary of the unseen realm. Soothsayers who had spent entire lifetimes building reputations on their supposed connection to hidden knowledge found their abilities gone almost overnight, their once reliable predictions suddenly worthless and inconsistent, their loyal clients growing confused and suspicious about why the whispers had gone silent after generations of steady supply. Some of these soothsayers, according to later accounts collected by Islamic historians, understood almost immediately what had happened, recognizing on some intuitive level that something powerful had entered the world, something strong enough to permanently seal off the very channel of stolen knowledge they had exploited for so long without consequence. The Quran itself references this guarding of the heavens directly, describing in clear terms how the devils among the jinn were driven back with flaming projectiles whenever they attempted to listen in on conversations that were never meant to be theirs to overhear. That is event number 9. The night the soothsayers of Arabia lost their supernatural power in what felt to them like a single, unexplainable instant. Alongside that came a 10th sign, closely related, the sudden and widespread failure of sorcery itself across the region. Magic and spellcraft had been woven deeply into pre-Islamic Arabian daily life. Curses purchased out of fear, charms bought for protection, love spells and hexes that people paid dearly for and genuinely feared the consequences of ignoring. According to the same cluster of narrations describing the night of the birth, the effectiveness of this widespread sorcery collapsed as well, seemingly overnight. Whatever unseen mechanisms had previously allowed these practices to function at all, mechanisms that Islamic theology generally attributes to a kind of cooperation between certain rebellious jinn and the human beings who sought them out for personal gain, were severed cleanly on that particular night. Magicians who had built entire careers on fear, manipulation, and the illusion of hidden power found their craft suddenly hollow and ineffective. Their once feared curses now landing with no more real-world consequence than empty, meaningless words spoken into the desert wind. If you place Event 9 and Event 10 side by side and really consider them together, a much larger pattern begins to form in front of you. It is not simply that a handful of unrelated miracles happened to occur around the timing of this particular birth. It is that the entire hidden economy of deception that had thrived for generations in pre-Islamic Arabia, the fortune tellers profiting from stolen whispers, the sorcerers profiting from manufactured fear, the 360 idols that people bowed to out of inherited habit rather than genuine conviction, all of it began losing its grip in that same narrow window of hours. As if the arrival of this particular child was never simply a birth in the ordinary sense, but rather the opening moment of a much larger unraveling, the beginning of the end for every false system that had kept the people of Arabia bound to lies for longer than anyone could remember. That is event number 10. Now for an 11th sign, one tied directly to earthly thrones and kingship rather than the unseen spiritual world. Multiple historical accounts describe that on the very morning following the prophet's birth, the thrones belonging to numerous kings across the wider region were discovered overturned, physically flipped from their normal upright position, found that way by startled servants and confused courtiers who could offer no explanation whatsoever for how it had happened sometime during the night. In a world where a king's throne represented the literal physical seat of his authority and legitimacy, the symbolic weight of finding it upended without any visible sign of intrusion, theft, or sabotage would have been genuinely impossible for the deeply superstitious rulers of that era to simply shrug off and ignore. Some later historians read this particular account in a somewhat more symbolic light, understanding it as a way early narrators expressed a much deeper underlying truth, that worldly kingship itself, in every form it had previously taken across the ancient world, was about to be fundamentally reordered by the arrival of this one child, whose eventual message would go on to topple the two greatest empires on earth, Persia and Byzantium both, not primarily through the strength of armies alone, but through the complete spiritual transformation of the ordinary people who would eventually carry his message forward across 3 continents. That is event number 11, and taken together with the numbered balconies of the Persian palace and the collapsing idols of Mecca, it forms part of a wider thread running through nearly all 12 of these signs, that the structures of power people had built their entire sense of security around, whether political, religious, or supernatural, were being quietly disturbed in that same short window of hours, long before any human being on earth understood why. And now, the 12th and final sign, the one that closes this entire circle and connects directly back to where our story first began tonight. In Persia, on that same remarkable night, the chief priest of the Zoroastrian faith, the leading Magian cleric personally responsible for interpreting signs and omens on behalf of the entire empire, experienced a vivid dream. In it, He saw powerful, heavily laden camels leading Arabian horses across the wide waters of the Tigris River, pressing deep into Persian territory uninvited, an image so unsettling that it stayed with him the moment he woke from sleep, drenched in a cold sweat despite the warmth of the Persian night. To a Persian religious leader steeped in symbolic interpretation, camels represented Arabia in its entirety, and the sight of a horse's crossing uninvited into Persian land represented nothing less than coming conquest and defeat. He reported this troubling dream directly to the royal court, entirely unaware in that moment that he was describing, in vivid symbolic language, the very future that awaited his own empire within his own lifetime and the lifetimes of his children. Decades later, the armies carrying forward the message of the child born that same night would indeed cross the Tigris River, would indeed conquer the whole of Persia, would indeed bring a final and permanent end to a dynasty whose exact remaining number of kings had already been silently counted out by 14 falling balconies on the very night it all quietly began. 12 signs, drawn together across deserts and empires that had no communication with one another that night, no shared messenger racing between them to coordinate a story. A war elephant that knelt down in the sand outside Mecca and simply refused to move. A Persian palace that shook violently and lost exactly 14 balconies, numbering out the exact remaining kings of an entire empire before those kings had even been born themselves. A 1,000-year fire, tended without interruption by generations of devoted priests, extinguished completely in a single unexplainable night. A sacred lake, large enough for ships to sail across, swallowed almost entirely into the thirsty earth. 360 idols surrounding a sanctuary they had no true right to surround, falling forward onto their carved faces in the dust. A disturbance felt as far away as distant Byzantium, reported here to you with full honesty about its comparatively weaker chains of historical narration. A mother who felt no physical burden throughout her entire pregnancy, and who dreamed of a light reaching all the way to Syria before her son ever took his very first breath of desert air. A small house filled with unexplainable illumination on the exact night of his birth. The soothsayers of Arabia losing their whispered connection to the unseen realm in a single devastating hour. Sorcery collapsing right alongside them in that same hour. Royal thrones found overturned by the following morning across the region, and a Persian priest dreaming, without any real understanding of what he was witnessing, of the very conquest that would one day permanently end his empire's long and proud existence. Consider what actually became of that infant over the decades that followed these 12 signs, because the signs only mean something if you follow the life they were pointing toward. He grew up an orphan, losing his father before birth and his mother by the age of 6, raised first by his grandfather Abdul Muttalib, and after his grandfather's death, by his uncle Abu Talib, a man of modest means who nonetheless took in his nephew without hesitation. He worked as a shepherd as a boy, then as a trader, earning a reputation across Mecca so consistent for honesty that people called him Al-Amin, the trustworthy one, years before he ever received a single word of revelation. He married Khadija, radiallahu anha, a successful businesswoman 15 years his senior, and remained devoted to her alone until her death, decades into their marriage. At the age of 40, in a cave called Hira on a mountain outside Mecca, he received the first words of the Quran through the angel Jibril, alayhi salam, an experience so overwhelming that he returned home, trembling, asking Khadija to cover him with a blanket, uncertain in that first terrifying moment what had just happened to him. From that point forward, for 23 years, he delivered a message that cost him everything the world usually considers valuable: wealth, comfort, safety, the goodwill of his own tribe. He was mocked, boycotted, and eventually forced to flee the city of his birth under cover of darkness, with assassins waiting outside his door. And yet he returned to that same city 8 years later, not as a vengeful conqueror settling old scores, but as a man who walked into Mecca and forgave nearly everyone who had once tried to kill him before personally destroying, with his own hands, the very idols that the 12 signs had already begun toppling on the night of his birth. None of this made the child born that night into a king, or a magician, or anything remotely other than exactly what he would spend the rest of his entire life insisting he truly was, a man chosen and sent by God to deliver a message. Nothing more than that, and nothing less than that either. He never once claimed these surrounding signs as proof of his own personal greatness or divinity. He never once, across 63 years of a genuinely difficult and often painful life, pointed back to the dramatic night of his own birth and asked to be worshipped or exalted because of it. The single greatest miracle he ever pointed people toward, again and again, was never the collapsing balconies of a distant Persian palace, but rather a book revealed to him piece by piece, word by carefully chosen word, over 23 difficult years of his adult life. A book that remains completely unchanged today, exactly as it was then, the Quran itself, which he personally recited aloud to those same Meccan men who had grown up hearing their own grandfathers describe, in vivid detail passed down around evening fires, the birds and the small stones that had saved the Kaaba only 50 days before he was ever born into their world. There is a verse in the Quran that captures this entire pattern more precisely than any of these 12 signs could on their own. Allah says, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. And these days we rotate them among mankind. It appears in the context of describing how victory and hardship pass between people across time, how no single condition, no matter how permanent it appears, stays fixed forever. A fire burning for 1,000 years looks, to anyone standing beside it, like something that will never go out. A palace built from stone that has survived 100 years of wars looks unshakable to anyone walking beneath its arches. And yet on one ordinary night, in the span of a single hour, both of them were undone, not by an invading army, not by a natural disaster anyone could point to and explain, but by the quiet arrival of a child in a house 400 miles away who had not yet even opened his eyes. If a fire that burned continuously for an entire 1,000 years could go completely dark in a single unremarkable hour, stop for a moment and ask yourself honestly what that says about the true permanence of anything you yourself have ever been told simply cannot be shaken or changed. If an empire's final 14 remaining kings could be silently numbered out on the very same night its own downfall first quietly began, ask yourself honestly how much of what looks so permanently unshakable to you, right now, today, in your own life, might already be, quietly and invisibly, counting down toward its own ending. The infant lying in that small house in Mecca did not yet know, in that very first hour of his own life, what he would eventually grow up to become, or what he would eventually be asked to carry. He could not have understood, wrapped in whatever cloth Amina had prepared for him, that a Persian king was staring at rubble where 14 balconies had stood only hours earlier, or that priests 400 miles away were failing, for the first time in 1,000 years, to relight a flame their entire theology depended on. He could not have understood that soothsayers scattered across the peninsula were suddenly finding their whispered sources gone silent, or that a Zoroastrian cleric was waking from a dream about camels and horses that he could not yet interpret. All of it was happening around a child too small to lift his own head, too young to do anything but breathe and cry, and be held by a mother who had already been told, in a dream of her own, that his name meant the most praised. But somehow, in ways historians still debate and theologians still marvel at, the fire seemed to know, the lake seemed to know, the idols, standing silent and lifeless for generations, somehow already knew enough to fall. Think back for a moment to where we began tonight. A king waking in the dark, unable to explain why his palace had just lost 14 balconies. A fire that had never once gone out across 1,000 years of careful tending, suddenly, silently, extinguished. A lake vanishing into the ground it had rested on for generations. None of these things happened because Mecca was powerful in the year 570. Mecca had no army capable of threatening Persia, no wealth capable of rivaling Byzantium, no political weight of any kind on the world stage. And yet the world moved anyway on that one particular night because something had entered it that no empire, however vast, could ignore forever, even if it would take that empire decades to understand exactly what it was looking at. If this story moved you even a little tonight, stay close, because there is so much more of his remarkable life still ahead of us to explore together. The long years of solitude in the cave above Mecca, the terrifying and overwhelming first moment of revelation, the desperate flight from a city that had grown determined to see him dead, and the eventual triumphant return to a Kaaba, finally standing free of every single idol that had once surrounded it for centuries. Tell me in the comments below exactly where in the world you're watching this from tonight. And if you want to see the next chapter of this extraordinary story unfold, make absolutely sure you're subscribed, because we are only 50 days and a single birth into a life story that would go on to change the entire course of human history forever. One that began quietly, in the dark, in a small house, in a small city that no empire on earth was watching that night.